Are we live?
It says live now. Okay, we'll just have to.
Should we start?
Okay, we just have to.
So can people hear us?
I think we just have to assume it works, and that everybody can hear us.
Can somebody write a comment if you can hear us?
Well, we can invite Claudia to our live stream.
All right, I guess we just go.
Is it like recording?
Yeah, it says live. Okay. All right. So we'll write a comment to this saying, begin watching at 1 minute. We are here because we are going to talk about debate. We are going to talk specifically about how to sort of use prep time, but more generally sort of about how to develop a good sort of relationship with your debate partner, both in terms of, enjoying the debate, but also in terms of like maximizing your brain power to really win that debate. Yeah. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about two broad things. Firstly, sort of like how you can develop good team chemistry with your partner, and secondly, how you can then sort of apply that in debate. And then I think partially we're going to talk about sort of, these concrete steps of like what you can do during prep time, but also sort of like what we sort of personally see as like what you should be doing. Just like a preface, I think this is very much our take on it. I think that there's probably like a lot of people that disagree with some things, but hey.
Yeah, I think we tend to talk, we tend to speak together at lots of tournaments and also at practices. And maybe for people who tend to rotate partners, it's a bit of a different story. And also I think maybe people are generally focused on developing their individual debating skills, whereas like we are very much focused on developing our team skill. So I guess like this is probably more applicable to people who want to get it with their team partner. But I think there's a lot of generally resources for people who want to become better debaters. So it's good to have our fresh take on it.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing that we're going to talk about is sort of developing good team chemistry with your partner. I guess the first thing that we should just chat about is like why this is important. So sort of like why, so yeah, question like why is it important to have good chemistry or trust your partner? Open question.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Do I answer it? Yeah, we wrote some things down here. I think, okay, whatever. No, it's good to have good trust with your partner because then everything goes a lot more smoothly during the prep time and during the debate. Kind of like you know what your different roles are, so you can just sit back and like trust that whatever they're supposed to be doing, they're doing. So it's like I always speak second, which means like, I mean, I'm listening very much during Jesper's speeches, but it's like I'm not leaning over while he's writing his speech and making sure that he has like enough like examples and like that he's like explaining the mechanism like every step, but it's like I just know he's gonna write the PM speech and it's gonna be fine. Yeah.
I think that like everybody, there's so many people out there and everybody has like a different way of seeing the world and like thinking about things. So I think part of this is also just sort of getting to know your partner in terms of getting to know, first of all, how they think, what they're good at thinking at, and like what they like sort of talking about. So I think like a big part of this is just figuring out, sort of like what they're going to do and like what's going to be good about it. So I think it's like, yeah, and like really different people like really have like different approaches to this. I guess it's like also knowing just like what you're capable of. So I think like part of this is that like many times when you're with a partner, there's going to be certain subjects which you both are really good at talking about. Sometimes there's subjects which neither of you are good at talking about, and then it's really good to like sort of like get to know those things. And I think like many times like teams don't really sort of sit down and really think about these things and think about your sort of like collective intellectual landscape. So how do we do these things? 2 concrete tips. Concrete tip number 1, develop a case file.
Oh yeah, okay. So what we did way before we went to our first tournaments together was we had a really long list of all the motions we could find, and then we just tried to kind of split them up into themes that we thought were like the intuitive themes. So we would have like, you know, the politics, and we would separate that into like subcategories we thought were relevant. And then we kind of went through and tried to analyze like, what do these different themes have in common? Like, what kind of arguments do we like to do for these kinds of motions? So as to kind of decide what is like the basic, like not necessarily like the content of the argument, but what's the logic of the argument that we would use for these kinds of cases. So it's like we just talked through like hundreds of motions, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we just talk, I mean, like, so we would go to like a cafe and sit and drink coffee and eat like biscuits and talk about like hundreds of motions. And I think part of this was we just realized that there were certain things that we really needed to improve on. But I think a big part of it was just sort of figuring out, like figuring out the types of things that we wanted to talk about for each of these motions. So like for a given like politics motion, there's going to be like different people that get excited about different things about the motion. And I think talking through these things, what we realized was there were certain aspects of this motion that we both got excited about and wanted to talk about, which means that, you know, when we talk about enough of these motions, you start to realize the kinds of things that you're drawn towards speaking about. And that means that you can sort of like develop those things and get really good at them.
Yeah, wait, I came up with a concrete example.
Yeah.
So I think like one thing is we really like international relations debates, especially Jesper. And I think like for international relations debates, we both tend to want to analyze the like capabilities of the different actors and their interests, whereas like we don't tend to talk so much about like the broader historical context or like broader institutional contexts. So I guess it's like, obviously with any motion, there's just tons of things to focus on, and there's just things that we tend to gravitate most to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's this thing where by talking a lot about these motions, what we did was we built up a case file. And I mean, I just wanted, like, because we really didn't like read stuff that like other debaters had done about it, right? We tried to like make it ourselves. I think the reason it's good to do that isn't because, you know, oh, you're smarter than everybody else. It's that in order to like be persuasive when given an argument, you have to have creative input into that argument, right? You have to be able to really easily follow the logic of that argument, and you're most easily able to do that if you're the one that is like coming up with those things. So it's kind of funny because we spent like a lot of time thinking about this and building up sort of a mental case file. At the same time, when we actually go to the tournaments, we don't really carry a case file around with us. Like I think like once we had like once we had like some piece of paper, but so it's like the thing is, but ever since we've had like no case file with us. But I think we sort of consider ourselves as having a case file in our brains that we sort of like draw back from memory, but also it's just something that sort of like informs the way we look. Anytime a motion comes up, we'll sort of instantly think about, well, this is this type of motion, and we know that we've talked a lot about this type of motion, and we know which motions it's sort of similar to.
Yeah, I think that's also like one thing is we have both kind of like specialty areas that we're like really extra excited about, like, you know, anytime it's like East Asian politics, Southeast Asian politics, you know, you're just really excited. You're
Rita,
really excited
like,
about the Middle East.
If there's a motion about like education, like university education, like that's just like Rita just gets set on fire.
Yeah,
it's
really
great.
excited. Yeah. So I think that's good, is to kind of know what the strengths are, but it's also good to know what your partner's weaknesses are, because if it's like a motion that comes up that's one of these, like especially the philosophy motions, I know that they tend to make Jesper a bit disheartened. So then you kind of like know that not only are you going to have to focus on the case, but also like a bit of like the pep talk and the support during the prep time, which is also very important. Very important to support your partner psychologically. To really be there for each other.
So I think that's the thing. I think it's like, so I think like the main point of this is just sort of knowing what you're going to be really good at, knowing what you're going to get really excited about, but also like sometimes knowing when you see a motion that this is going to be like a little bit tougher. We both have to just like focus on this one and really figure out like what we're doing.
Yeah, and also if you both don't know anything about one type of motion, that's, you can try reading about it more.
Yeah.
We had a hard time with some economics motions because we've only had some economics courses. So we had Gustav explain a lot of economics debates to us for an hour.
Yeah. We had to sit down and like we saw it as our mission. We had like, this is our mission now to like learn a bit of like this econ stuff. Okay.
It's like your case law. And also, like, obviously, I guess people maybe don't want to spend this much time, which is reasonable. And then it's like, I guess you don't really have to invent all the arguments on your own. But, you know, if you've been practicing for a while, then you have some ideas about, like, what are, like, the things people run. Like, I know the gov case for these kinds of motions.
Yeah.
And then it's good anyway to talk things through so you can figure out, like, that you're just on the same page and maybe your partner knows less than you.
Yeah. But I think, like, and, like, the thing is just that this isn't, like, this, you know, tournament prep thing necessarily that you have to do before you go in tournament. I think it's, like, if you know that you're going to debate with somebody somewhere, you know, you can sit down sort of, like, I mean, it can be, like, a long time before the tournament or something. And you can just sit down and, like, talk about it and get to know how, like, you think about things. Tip number 2, watch a lot of debates together. Have we watched debates together, Rita?
Oh, yeah.
Have we spent some, like, Friday nights when everybody else was out clubbing, sitting at home, like, watching World's finals and semifinals?
Maybe.
Yeah, we have. It was really fun.
It was fun.
Yeah.
We had popcorn.
Popcorn, ice cream sometimes.
Ice cream. Okay. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, watching debates. Yeah. So what do? We don't necessarily watch the entire debate. You can just watch some speeches. So I think, like, the point there is that when you're in the debate, you want to know how your partner is perceiving the debate, right? Because Jesper and I, we have really different styles of rebuttal. We have really different things that we focus on. And also, like, somebody might be going on about something, and I think it's super stupid, like, whatever. But Jesper might not think it's super stupid because he, like, understands that there's, like, a broader case there, which I'm missing because, you know. So I think it's, like, really good to, like, understand how your partner perceives the debates so that during the debate round, you kind of can more anticipate what they're going to focus on in terms of rebuttal. And maybe, like, if you know that there's some kind of arguments that they're impressed by, but you think are, like, easy to rebut, then that's something you can tell them about during the debate more.
Yeah. And I think that another thing is, like, because it's like, so it's like we'll watch a speech. After the speech is over, we'll sort of pause it. Sometimes we'll pause, like, partway through and just talk about, like, is this good, is this bad? And I think, again, it's like this rebuttal thing. So I think that we found it really useful to focus on, like, the bad stuff in all these speeches and try to, like, really sort of, like, tear it apart, you know, sitting on our couch and sort of talk about, like, these are things that are bad. And I think that what it sort of eventually does is, because obviously it's like many of these speeches are, like, great, but I think in the same way that you need to get sort of excited about the cases that you can bring, I think you can also get sort of excited together about the ways in which you wanted to rebut arguments. So I think that in a sense, it's like you build up ideas about why people in general are sometimes stupid in debates. And I don't mean that as, like, people being stupid, because, like, obviously everybody's really smart, but in terms of, like, what can you, like, point out that is, like, a weakness together. And I think it's this thing where it's like, in the same way, it's like building up, like, a case file. It's also like building up this sort of, like, rebuttal file in terms of, like, these are, like, the things that we like to attack teams on.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like, oh, this person is, like, going on and on about their principle, but they have, like, not explained at all, like, why this principle is, like, inviolable and why it matters the most. Or, like, oh, like, this person has spent 3.5 minutes on, like, their impacts, but they have, like, not explained their mechanism at all. And once you, like, start to focus on those kinds of things, then you can maybe be better at spotting that in different speeches.
And I think this is, like, I mean, this is sort of, like, I mean, this is, like, a little bit separate from, like, what we're really talking about, but I think it is just, like, worth noting that it's, like, a really big confidence booster. So I think that, you know, so it's like in the same way that, like, you know, it's a great confidence boost to feel like, you know, you see emotion, you can come up with good arguments for it. I think it's like a confidence booster both individually to feel that you can walk into like a really good room and like sort of like attack teams in that room, but also feel like you can do it together and have like a collective idea of like the way in which you can like try to tear other teams down.
Yeah, tear them down.
In like a nice way.
I mean, I think like, yeah, it's definitely nice because when you're first kind of ending up in these really tough rooms, it's like, oh shit, we're against that team. What's going to happen?
Yeah.
But I guess after like pausing Shengwu every 5 seconds to like scream about how stupid he's being, like, I guess you just get less intimidated by the really fancy people because you really internalize this idea that, you know, your case can still stand.
Yeah.
Yeah. So watching the videos, but I think, yeah, like preparing like the case file is especially important, and you get some shared vocabulary, kind of like ideas about where you want to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's like the big word here is like together. It's that like, you know, you go through all these things together, partially to like, so it's like obviously this will develop you individually as a debater, because obviously after going all these things, like both Rita and I are better if we were to debate with anybody else. But I think the main thing here is that like it really builds the ability, your ability to like think, cooperate, and like plan things together and think things together, right? So I think it's like we sort of like very highly value the way that you sort of build your own like individual teamwork. And I think it's like we would really recommend like if you find somebody you enjoy debating with, just like stick with that person like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's tempting out there. You know, it's a lot of different opportunities, partners, you know, feels like when is the right time to settle down? Won't I be missing out on things if I commit too early? But, you know, ultimately, you know, a stable relationship is the basis for success.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in your romantic life.
Yeah.
It's not a prescriptive statement.
Yeah.
But debate, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else to say about like why it's important to develop good chemistry? I think like with, you know.
I think it's like, I think with this thing we talked about like your team dynamic, that there are lots of people who kind of, you know, a lot of times you just end up speaking with somebody at a tournament who you're, you know, not best friends with, and maybe you're not super excited about speaking with that person. It's just like what worked out. And even in those cases, even if you're not going to build this kind of long-term partnership, I think it's just really good to try anyway and find this kind of like psychological team space that you occupy, because I guess a lot of times people kind of like they're just like two separate speakers, and then one person goes up and the other person thinks their idea is better, so they go up and explain their version of the case instead. Mm-hmm. And what you end up with is kind of this, the team becomes disjointed, which I think hurts you in the round because you're just like less internally coherent. Like, you know, if you're not confident about your extension speaker, then as a whip speaker, you kind of come up and try to whip what you would have said if you were them. But I think that it's just not a really great strategy, and you should just try to kind of have the team spirit and focus on your respective roles. But I guess we're going to talk about that now. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so moving on to the second thing. So it's like, okay, you're convinced. You bought it. You're like, I need to have good chemistry with my partner. It's not just about me being a smart person. It's not about my partner being a smart person. It's about being smart together. Okay, how does that look like? How do you apply that? All right, this is when we get to this, like, you know, practical bit to this. Practical / philosophical. So I think that the first thing we want to talk about a little bit is sort of our approach to debate that is maybe sort of like different from what a lot of other people think. And the main thing that we want to talk about here, I think, is, or the first thing that we talk about is speaker roles. So, I mean, I think the main thing is that we really see the role of the site. So just for context, in all debates that we ever do, I'm the first speaker and Rita's the second speaker, both in opening half and in closing half. And I think we would like never ever like switch roles. And I think that, yeah, I mean, like, 'cause it just sounds like in our heads, it's like, oh, that would be so weird. It would be really bad. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we see these roles as being really, really different, and they're being very different skills that you both just need to be good at, but that you also need to like sort of like develop, and sort of like in a sense, it's like you have these separate, you know, turfs almost that you're on during the debate, both in prep time and in the debate. So what are those roles? You know.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So the idea that is like we split the things up between the first and the second speech, both I think in terms of how we structure the prep time, but also obviously just based on what the speaker needs to accomplish. So I guess Jesper as the first speaker is supposed to set up the like framing of the debate and explain our case essentially in terms of like a logical like progression of arguments, and he's the one that kind of fills in the different steps in any mechanism and has a lot of examples and just like really puts the meat on the bone. So it's like that's where we have most of our text is in Jesper's speech. And then in terms of the second speech, whether it's an opening half or like in the whip speech, I guess what I usually focus more on is like listening to what the other teams have said. So putting our case in the context of the debate more broadly, you know, clarifying anything that wasn't clear or like adding either like an extending point to our case or just like more details, especially in response to things other people may have said or kind of ideas I have while Jesper is speaking. But the idea is more that like I explain our case and just like repeat all the best parts of it and try to sell it, whereas Jesper kind of puts it out there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think that, we were talking about this earlier, I think that we see this as being like a very strict divide. So I think that sometimes what tends to happen, I'm not saying it happened to you, but sometimes what happens is that speakers are a little bit selfish, and they think that they're really smart, and they have this really cool idea. And sometimes they either don't trust that their partner is going to say it, or feel like they need to get it out there no matter what. So sometimes you'll have maybe like a whip speaker that starts like bringing out this like new argument because they were upset that like their extension speaker didn't say it. Or sometimes you have like a first speaker start like really outlining the clash extensively because they're like, oh, you know, I don't think that my partner is going to cover this. And I think like for us, it's this thing where it's like, if we have like emotion and like we're OG and I go up and I totally like do like a bad speech, I totally focus on all the wrong things. Like Rita is not going to go up there and like bring out the good stuff that we should have said. She'll just really try to like run with the things that I've said and explain like why they're like still good. So I think the thing is like we see this as like this like super strict thing, because I mean we're gonna like get to this like a little bit, but I think it's when you develop this and see it as like a really sharp divide, I think that both you really get good at the skills that are important for this. And I think that's when you start to like really maximize what you're able to do with like the 7 minutes that you have each. And sort of like trust that your partner is going to do the rest, which means that if you're a first speaker, you can really spend 7 minutes giving examples, characterizing, like, you know, mechanisms, all that stuff. And if you're the second speaker, you spend 7 minutes contextualizing all that in the context of the debate and sort of like putting all of your arguments like in relation to stuff that the other side has said.
And doing the rebuttal.
Yeah, and doing the rebuttal. So then it's like you sort of like maximize the time. So that's like our sort of like general thing that we really see these roles as really different, both even in opening half. Yeah. And then in terms of like, okay, so that's like this one thing. I don't know if this is like the most structured workshop ever.
This is a great structure.
This is great structure.
Great.
Moving on. So then I think.
No, we should talk about the prep time. How you do the prep time, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was like we have a subpoint here.
Oh yeah.
We have an outline.
Yeah, we have an outline.
Okay, yeah. So we had this. We were gonna talk about practical tips for all you people wanting to adopt the Rita and Jesper prep time method. So we have this like role divide, which means that Jesper is primarily responsible for making it clear what our case is when we got there. So as soon as we get the motion, we try to find somewhere like quiet, and then most of the time, yeah, we take a minute to kind of think quietly, but most of the time we just have Jesper start by talking for like 2 minutes or so about like all the stuff he thinks about the motion. And during that time, I'm like writing down the things I think that are good out of what he's saying, and I'm trying to make headlines out of the main arguments that he's doing. And the reason like we do it like this is because Jesper's the first speaker. He's the one that has to explain the case. So it makes sense that we start with the arguments that he finds like most intuitive, because the more intuitive an argument is to you, the better you explain it. But obviously, like if the argument isn't good, we're like, you know, we find a different thing. Or if like the motion is a bit tricky, then we just talk through it together for a while until we get onto something. Or if I'm really excited about something, I just start talking. But it's like we really try to focus first on like what is like the core ideas Jesper can come up with, and then we try, and then I kind of listen and I reflect on like what I think are strong headlines and what are strong arguments in what you're saying.
Yeah, because I think that, and one of the reasons for this is that I think many times, if like for instance, like I'm the one that sort of like starts speaking, I don't think you necessarily end up with like super different things depending on who's saying it, because many times the stuff that you talk about in the initial prep time are many times things that are, in a sense, like obvious, or like things that like flow quite naturally with emotion. So it's like if you see emotion, like most of the time there's going to be a few like prop or like ARP arguments that sort of like flow very natural. It's like, well, these are like clearly things that we need to be talking about. And I think it's like so many times, you know, like, so it's like I'm just going to talk, like when I start talking, many times the things that I say, it's not like I'm expecting Rita to get blown away by it, because 99% of the time she really isn't. But I think that it's sort of the process of speaking. So it's like when you start to speak, you know, like you start picking up speed, you start getting more excited about it, and you start thinking about, okay, where is this taking me? Where is this taking me? And then many times, like Rita will sort of like guide the discussion by sort of asking certain questions and being like, well, what about this? Or like, what about that? And many times those questions aren't like meant, I mean, like those questions aren't meant to be like roadblocks, but more like, you know, like get over this, like where are we going to take this next? Where are we going to get this next? So like sometimes it's even like almost this hostile thing where it's like, well, it's like, so what? Well, like, you know, this is stupid. And then I'm like, wait, no, it's not stupid because this. And then it's like that sort of, it's this like process where I think that it is this thing where it's like the first speaker has to be able to articulate this in prep time, or the first speaker won't be able to articulate it during the debate.
Yeah, and another thing is that we want to spend less time writing. So in first half, I guess you start writing a bit earlier, like at like how many minutes?
Like around 10 minutes.
Like 10 minutes. Then Jesper starts writing a speech. But in second half, it's like 12 minutes. You write in the room. Yeah.
So I mean, just in terms of that. So when we're in first half, I need to have like something written down if I'm going to be like the first speaker in like OG or OO. So usually it's like we'll talk without like writing stuff down for like 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, I've got like 5 minutes, write down the headlines, and then just like jot notes. For second half, like at the end of prep time, all we need is sort of like these basic headlines for arguments that we want to talk about. But there's no like filling in the stuff, because if you're in second half, you have like loads of time during the debate to like think of the examples you want to talk about.
Because you don't have to listen as closely, because your second speaker is listening to everything very closely.
Yeah, exactly.
Division of labor.
Trust.
Okay, but yeah, and the thing was that we spend less time writing, but we tried to get Jesper to talk through the arguments during the prep time, because it's like more effective having done like a mini speech about the motion.
Yeah.
Because then you have like already like done a trial run of explaining this one like argument, and you've gotten live feedback on it.
Yeah.
So it's very efficient and really.
Yeah. And then it's like, so I think many times, like, so going back to this like first, second speaker thing, many times after a while, when we have like this idea about stuff, like we want to talk about, you will think sort of specifically about like the other side, about sort of like strong arguments. So it's like already in prep time, like Rita's thinking about like the clash, what the clash of the debate is going to be. So think about sort of these strong things that are going to come from the other side. And many times then it's like when we have an idea of the things we want to talk about, Rita will say, look, this is a really strong thing that the other side is going to say. How does that fit into the stuff that we have now? So I think many times, like even in prep time, we're already thinking about how to sort of like counter these things, or how to sort of make sure that our arguments sort of are going to beat them, or sort of like outframe them. And I think some of the time, you know, it's like when prep time is going super smooth, we have time to really sort of like position this in terms of the stuff that how I'm going to present it. And sometimes it is this thing where Rita does this thing where it's like, I'm going to think about this during the debate and I'm going to figure it out. And then I'm just going to like really just trust that she's going to figure it out. So many times like we'll go into the debate, we'll both know that there's this killer argument from the other side that's going to come out. But, you know, Rita just is going to take care of it and I just focus on the stuff that I have to get out. Which is kind of funny because it's like for me, I'm just like, yeah, I'm just focusing on my thing. And Rita's sitting there really have to think hard about it.
Yeah. Okay.
But,
no, it works really good.
Yeah. So I think, so that's like the basic thing about, I think like the main thing there is that this first speaker thing should also affect and guide the way that you use your 15 minutes of prep time.
Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to say about that is that, yeah, if you spend most of your prep time basically writing up the first speech, and then you have the second speech really as like an accessory to the first speech, then you have both written the first speech, and then like the argument's obviously stronger, but it's also that you have incorporated your shared vocabulary. Yeah. And as a second speaker, then you have even heard some like preview of the speech, so you know what's coming. And then you can like really repeat the phrasing that your partner is using quite naturally, and you maybe know what their examples are, so when you're writing your second speech, you can build that in. And then when you echo what your partner says, it just becomes like a much more cohesive case. And you know, when the opposition teams also hear it repeated twice, I mean, it just like means they have to respond to it more. Yeah. And anything that is like unclear, or the judge will get more. But also it just like kind of sticks out. Like a lot of times we'll have like, you know, these 2 or 3 word kind of catchphrases that will run through the debate, because we make sure to set up like that as the important thing. Yeah,
and like from the perspective of like a second speaker, like I don't know much about it, but I've heard that like one of the nightmares is, you know, like being like a whip speaker or something and sort of being slightly surprised at what your extension speaker is saying, or like being a little bit unsure about what's going to happen. And I think that's sort of this thing that you really want to try to avoid. Like you really want to be like clear on what you're going to talk about, not clear on like, you know, the examples or like the specific mechanism and stuff, but really, really clear on like the broad thing that you're trying to do in the debate.
Yeah, and that's the thing also with extension speeches, because obviously you have to kind of modify your extension based on what came out in top half, like fine. But as long as you both know what your essential like case is, which we're going to talk about now, like the way that the extension gets refined should not be a surprise to you. Yeah, that's really something you want to avoid.
Yeah. Now, getting to the most exciting bit, it's talking about the importance of a case. So I guess like a case, like I mean, like I wouldn't say that like this is like our unique contribution to the debating world, because obviously
just really uniquely
bring you the concept of the case, because obviously a lot of people talk about like having a case in debate, but I think it's like thinking about this concept of so it's like, what is a case? I think like a case is this central underpinning like idea or like driving force behind like what you're trying to do in the debate. So it's like you're gonna have different arguments, you're gonna have a principle, you're gonna have like an outcome, you're gonna maybe have like several different like outcomes that are good for your side. But like behind all of this, what is like the broad thing that you're trying to prove in the debate? And obviously this is something that you know, like a lot of people will say is like sort of like necessary, but I think it's like really thinking about what it should be is something that has helped us a lot in debate.
Yeah, and the debates when we don't manage to get to like the case and we just have like a collection of arguments, those are the debates where we feel like the least certain. Yeah. They don't always go bad, But like.
But it's like the speeches are like not like things like even if it's good, it's like the speeches aren't very sexy.
No,
yeah. Like you can't really get to this like soaring rhetoric or whatever. But yeah, so I think the idea there is that you want to, so like during prep time, for instance, when we're sort of like talking about the arguments, we'll have like a moment when we sort of know broadly like the arguments that we want to talk about, where we sort of like backtrack and sort of think like, what is this all about? Like, what is it that we're fighting for or like against? And many times like what we want to try to do is, I mean, this isn't like a strict guideline, but really try to like reduce it to like one sentence or like one sort of like catch line or one sort of phrase that we can both use. And I think it's like we'll use like examples. We're going to talk about examples to illustrate this. But yeah, it's just like figure out like this like central thing that you want to do.
Okay, the theme.
The theme. That's a good word. Theme. So examples. Should I go? Should you go?
Yeah, no, you go.
You go? I go?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the first time we thought that this went really well was we were in a, what was it, quarterfinal of Budapest Open 2016, the first tournament we ever went to together. And what happened there was that, so what was the motion? The motion was this house supports the destruction of like the Calais Jungle. So this was sort of like, you know, moment of like high movement of people into the European Union. There were a lot of people that were in Calais trying to cross to get to the UK. They had built this sort of like makeshift settlement, and France had taken the decision that they were going to destroy this settlement. And I think the concept was that they were going to sort of like either tell people that they had to leave and deport them, or sort of force them to enter the refugee, like, or the asylum process in France, rather than just sort of like trying to get to the UK. We were opposition, so we were against the destruction of this makeshift camp. And so we had like, so it's like, okay, so we were talking like, what are the arguments? And we had this sort of like principle that these people aren't doing anything wrong and you're hurting them. We had this like a lot of impacts about how this like harms them, about how it harms these people just like very directly. And it's sort of like this, you know, encroaches like people's human dignity that everybody, you know, deserves. We had these arguments about like political ramifications of this, how it's going to sort of strengthen like, you know, nationalism and like xenophobia and populism. And it was when people were like really starting to use the word populism a lot.
Yeah.
It was, you know, so young, so naive. And then we were like, okay, so it's like we have all these arguments, but like what's like a way of like combining all of these things into like one sort of main concept?
Do you have it?
Yeah, I remember it.
Okay.
So the concept was that what it was France was exercising sort of its monopoly on violence as a tool of political violence to show that it's like trying to be in control.
Yeah, right. So our essential case, so like the theme was that like this action is only like intended or able to serve as like a show of French government like willingness to like use violence to enforce its migration policy.
Yeah. So it's like so things like from the motion, this house supports the, you know, destruction of the Calais Jungle. It's like obviously violence is like an element of that motion, but I think it's like there's like lots of different ways in which you can like take the motion. But I think we really settled on this thing that like the violence bit is the bit that is bad. Like the fact that you're forcing this. And it's this thing where it's like, when you think about the motion, like it seems kind of obvious, like it seems, but the reason it seems obvious is because it just like fits very neatly. So then it's like, you know, then it's like all of the arguments that you talk about, you have this separate, this one political effect, then you have this like one sort of principle, then you have like these impacts. All of these like tie back to this like point of like violence. the thing is, it doesn't have to be violence. It can be something else. Like it could have been some other like sort of word or catchphrase, but there was one unifying concept that tied all of these different arguments together.
And we had the catchphrase, and so we were,
Yeah,
confident.
And we were through. We went through to the semifinal, which did not go well.
We did not have a case.
We did not have a case in the semifinal. But I think that the idea there is that like, so that's sort of an example, and we can have more examples. But that's like our overall goal in the debate. And I think that, tying it back to the stuff we were talking about earlier, this stuff is like, I think it is sort of like taking it to the next level, where it necessitates you trusting and being able to think with your partner, and also understanding what you both get excited about. Because no matter what the case sort of like is going to be, or what the central concept is going to be, you both have to get excited about it, which means that you both have to trust that the other partner is going to be really into it and like that idea. And that's why, like...
Yeah, I think a lot of the time what we talk through is like, so Jesper starts saying his argument. I'm like writing down what the headlines are, and I'm like, okay, so based on what we've talked about, I like these, like this has the first headline, this is the second headline, but like, where are we really going with this? And we kind of keep brainstorming a little bit until we get to this point where we're like, oh, yes, like that's it. Oftentimes Jesper like jumps up at this point and is like pacing around a bit. Yeah. So I'm kind of waiting for like this moment, and after that, then we're like, okay.
Yeah. So this actually like, so this is, like fun story. I don't know if this like 100% like necessary for people to know, but this is like so true. Like it's literally true that around half of all prep times, at one point at around like the 8-minute marks, when I feel like we've made like a breakthrough, I literally like jump up. Like if we're sitting down, I'll jump up and start jumping, and I'll be like, oh, and then usually like if that happens during prep time, like I think like we always win the debate.
Yeah, we haven't lost the debate.
Like I don't think we've ever lost a debate when we get that excited about something.
That would be really disheartening.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about like another example?
Yeah.
Wagner.
The Wagner one. Yeah? Should we take the one? Yeah, okay. What was the motion?
So this was from Euros 2016. It was round 5, I believe. It was so the idea was that in the status quo, sometimes they play Wagner in the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra plays Wagner, and there have been protests outside of it because Wagner was an anti-Semite, and his music was used a lot by the Nazi regime in Germany. So I think the idea there, the motion was something, this House believes that the Philharmonic Orchestra should play Wagner. So yes,
we were in opposition.
We were in opposition. So government's idea was so it's like OG gets up, and I mean like OG was very, very good. They set up this idea about this is a way of detangling the music from like the past and sort of like reclaiming the tragedy in some way, and sort of saying that we don't have to be haunted by the tragedy of the past. We can live and like accept that these like the music exists today and sort of like enjoy it for what it is, and they did it really, really well. Our idea was
we were closing opposition. Yeah, so our opening opposition kind of went up and did a lot of the basic thing about, oh, this is like, also they did it really good. It was like, oh, this is like bad for the musicians who have to play this music. It's bad maybe for Holocaust survivors who see flyers for this. So, I mean, like, they had a lot of the arguments that you want to bring in opposition. I think, like, what we did really good in that round was we came up with this great, our great case was, like, Wagner is not, like, a composer whose music was, like, used for anti-Semitic purposes. He was an anti-Semite who composed music in accordance with his like ideology.
Yeah.
So that was like our like catchphrase in that round, and then we kind of structured all of our arguments against that. So our idea was that like sure, it's beautiful, but we kind of made this like argument about who Wagner was and what his music was like, and tried to more like say that this anti-Semitism was like a core part of his music. And so once we establish that, then we can go back to, it's legitimate for the musicians not to have to do this, because of this, but also we could go to like, oh, like this Israeli Symphonic Orchestra is such an important member of the like international cultural scene.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of like signaling power. So it's good that they say this is unacceptable.
And also, there was also a concept that sort of people in Israel are right to be very skeptical of the cultural elite when they choose to associate with something that is like inherently anti-Semitic.
Yeah. So I mean, so we do like kind of a lot of this basic, like, this is bad, all of these different like people don't want this arguments, but we structure it together with like our one core concept, which is that like the music can't be separated from like the anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And that was really nice.
Yeah.
It was.
And it's one of those things where like in that example, it is obviously like a big part of that is just a piece of like recharacterization. So it is sort of like an argument in itself that needs to be defended in of itself. But there is that one thing that ties to like all of these different arguments. And I think it's like all debaters, like, I mean, no matter how long you've debated for, like if you're relatively inexperienced, like to some extent, like you probably do this, right? Like a lot of people probably do this. I think that like a big part of like becoming better at debate is just sort of like about recognizing how important it is, and sort of like recognizing how important these things are to sort of like, you know, doing well in a debate, and really having something that you're going to be excited about, that you can be excited about together. Yeah. Should we give another example?
Should we go for the second?
The Google?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. One more example.
Okay, so.
Around. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. So one more that we want to talk about is, what was this? The Riga Open.
Oh, it was Riga. I thought it was a Euros round.
No. Yeah.
Okay, so we were in Riga Open before Euros this year, and they had the round about the James Damore, that Google engineer who wrote the memo. It was very controversial. Are men and women equal? Here's some footnotes.
And then he was fired.
Yeah, Google fired him. Controversial decision, meriting a debate. Ultimately, Google fired him. So then the motion was like, oh, this house regrets Google's decision to fire this guy.
Yeah.
We were in opposition, so we support Google in this debate, in firing the guy. And yeah, so once again, like the Gov team, I guess, would they come up and they're like, oh, this is an opportunity for this is a missed opportunity for discourse, which is like, oh, this guy, he wrote a memo that said Google is an echo chamber, then you fire him, so like doesn't look good, backlash, all of these problems. Okay, right, we were in opposition, so we are trying to think of like our theme, because obviously like there's a lot of points that you can make in this debate, which is all like, oh, men and women, they can equally be software engineers, or like, oh, like diversity programs are threatened, or like, oh, or he's like a walking lawsuit,
or like, you know, he just makes like coworkers uncomfortable, and people can't trust that they're going to have like a good working relationship with him, so he's not a good asset for the company. You know, he's a you know, negative employee or whatever. But what did we say?
Yeah, we had a case, and the case we came up with, which was like the structure around which we had the rest of our points, was that like the extent to which like sex determines people's like skills and abilities in terms of computer and other work isn't something that can conclusively be like decided. So our idea was, and this is, so we kind of like characterized the debate as like, okay, we don't really know whether women and men have the same like level of skills or the same level of interest in coding, because there's a lot of research that shows that, you know, like there's the discrimination, there's biases, there's a lot of like problems. At the same time, it's like, oh, men are like, you know, 2.5% faster at like solving algorithm problems or something, you know. So it's like, I mean, the thing is that the reason there's a lot of scientific references you can use for both sides is because like it isn't really clear to decide.
Yeah.
Anyway, so our point was that given this framing, that there is no like conclusion that can be reached and there's no way the debate can be settled, then there is no like there's nothing really to be gained to continue having the debate because it isn't clear what kind of evidence would ever change anybody's mind.
Yeah.
Let me explain this. Good.
Yeah. So the idea is basically that the whole debate surrounding it, the discussion, is a big like unknown. Like you can't ever have like a good productive discussion, not because people are gonna like shut you down or something, but there's just something inherently about the discussion of like these sort of like, I don't know, sex disposition of people like with regards to like their capabilities that like you just don't know. There's no like study that can conclusively prove anything about it.
Yeah, so as long as Google wants to keep having affirmative action policies, they're never going to be able to like justify that by saying, well, science has concluded that men and women are exactly the same, or you know, like science has completely disproven that. Like they can say like lots of studies disprove this, blah blah, but it's like they're never going to be able to like point to like this one piece of evidence and be like, aha, like this is why we need to have these diversity programs. So our case kind of was like that it can't be something that is driven by like a scientific consensus, but it's based on like, you know, social, political, economic, cultural considerations within the company.
And I think that the way that we arrived there was, if you look at like then like the specific arguments that we were making. I mean, like one of our arguments was, for instance, talking about why, if there was a discussion, would it not be good discussion, right? So sort of like analyzing what will the people who do oppose sort of affirmative action programs say, and will a lot of people support that or not? So I think that like a lot of the arguments were more about how like what the audience was going to be like, or it's like what the discussion was going to be like, what side people would be on, what is Google's sort of like possibilities to move forward on this, maybe like broader political implications of this, and those are sort of like the arguments. Those were sort of like the mechanisms that we were like laying out, but all those tied back to this like central core idea of discussion is impossible, so Google should just decide that it wants to do this, and that's like, you know, the best that we can do. So I think that, and I think like one thing that I want to say about like all of these examples is that we see this as like us having this one case that attaches to like all these arguments. I don't think always the judges necessarily see that way. Like so many times like the judges will see it as like, oh, you did this bit of characterization and then you did this bit of like, you know, thing, and like, or maybe see it as like an argument that it rests like alongside these other arguments. And I think that's fine. I think like the main point about this, and like the point of like having a case, isn't necessarily that that's what you want the audience to pick up on, but it's that you and your partner need to be really clear on the things that you're going to be talking about, right? So this is more of a tool of making sure that you have good teamwork and coherency during the debate, rather than, you know, for a speech to be good, it must have a case.
Yeah, and I think it's about like knowing, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to have like 3 points in the first speech, and maybe you can add something in the second speech, and you know how all of these different points tie together. So you kind of know like the general thrust of what you are trying to do together, rather than just kind of trying to think of like a list of all the good arguments that you can make, which is like also a good strategy for when you can't find a case. But we just, it adds this coherence if you have a theme.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have a theme. I think that's it.
Yeah.
We should summarize.
Yeah, we should summarize. So what do we tell you? So it's like going back to this first stuff we started talking about, because like I swear, the stuff that we have said is not just like ramblings, like it does connect together. And I think the main thing that we want to say is like in the very beginning is that it's good to have good teamwork with your partner, good chemistry with your partner, to spend a lot of time and effort getting to figure out like what they like talking about and the arguments that they like to run and the things that they're good at, and to figure out the stuff that you like talking about together. Because, you know, when we start talking about the application, first speaker, second speaker, what you do during prep time, what you do during the debate, all of those things are really only possible to do well if you really trust your partner and have a good idea of what you can talk about that is going to like produce a good debate or like good speeches.
Yeah, just keep going. You're doing great.
Yeah, I mean, so I think like on one hand, this means that you become better at debate. It means that you become better individually as a debater, because the more that you do this, the more you get to develop your own skills. It means that you get better as a team, because you just like soar right up high. You're gonna like break all the tournaments. You're gonna become world champions. You're maybe one day gonna break at Euros. And just keep going. But also, it means that you, in the success of your debating, you also just get to have like a really fun time with your partner. And because I think like one of the things that we really sort of like stress here, in terms of getting the case, in terms of prepping, is really to get excited about the debate. And I think that's the thing. Like, I think we go to a lot of tournaments, we debate a lot, not necessarily because like we want to win everything or we think it's really exciting to sometimes be successful, but because we think it's really fun to be in the debate itself. And I think that you really want to get to a point where you and your partner can be excited to debate together, and not see yourself as sort of like, oh, like we've been assigned to speak together, or I wish that I was like speaking with like, I don't know, like somebody else. But really get to this point where it's like you can have like a fun shared experience. Because I think that that's the only time when I think that like anybody that does like competitive debate should be doing it because they think it's fun. And you're only really going to get there if you can get excited during the debate. And one of the ways in which you get excited in debate is to spend a lot of time with your partner and really developing that chemistry.
I think that sounds beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's one person watching this right now. I think that's the number up there, one person. But
thank
you, whoever is watching. We hope that this serves you well. And is like a tournament, right, happening or something?
I don't know.
If this is a tournament, good luck to everyone.
Okay.
And if it's not, excuse my ignorance.
Okay.